The world of marketing and PR has turned into quite the frenzy, and it's not easy to navigate the ever-changing landscape. Join me in my journey to learn from the best, as some of the world's top marketing and PR professionals share their stories on ways you can harness these changes to grow your brand. It's time to fuel the frenzy. Hello and welcome to the Fuel the Frenzy podcast and our video podcast, which is aired on Facebook Live. It's fantastic to be here. And today is particularly special because I have two lovely ladies with me today. It made sense to me that we invite our very own Katie Kern. I'm going to let her introduce herself. She's here today to really kind of manage this wonderful interview, and obviously Ericka Davis. So let me first of all, Katie, why don't you introduce yourself and share a little bit about what you do?
Absolutely. I am Katie Kern, the VP of Marketing and Public Relations for Media Frenzy Global, and I'm pretty much responsible for managing the team, helping with strategies, and overall branding for Media Frenzy.
Okay, and Ericka, it's fantastic to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here, ladies.
We last saw you on our panel for the PR Reimagined event, and it was very inspiring listening to you talk about what you've been doing at the BeltLine. So maybe you can share a little bit of details about yourself for us.
Oh, sure. I am Erika Davis, and I am Communications and Media Relations Director for the Atlanta BeltLine, and I'm responsible for strategic communications, branding, and marketing in all of our social media platforms, publications, print, you name it. Any way that we communicate to the media and to the general public, that it falls under me and my team.
And for those people who may not be from Atlanta, what is the Atlanta BeltLine?
What do you mean? People don't know what the Atlanta BeltLine is.
Well, I'm from England. I wouldn't have heard about it.
We actually have someone from England working for us.
You do?
Yes,
Okay,
so
no
she does.
excuse.
So Vicky is probably saying right now, I know what the Atlanta BeltLine is. It is a transformative project, a system of trails, transit, parks, and it's really reforming the city of Atlanta and just revitalizing 45 neighborhoods that will connect in schools through a system of trails and pathways. And so right now we're excited because, you know, we have the East Side Trail, which I'm sure if you've had the opportunity to get on it, Pond City Market, and just walk your dog or walk your children or just walk yourself. It's great, and on Friday we'll be expanding to the West Side Trail, so we're talking about 22 miles of trails, and we're going to connect around the heart of Atlanta. I'm looking for marathons in our future. I won't be running them, but I'm looking forward to them, hopefully someday on the Atlanta BeltLine. So we hope everybody, if you haven't gotten out on it, it's wonderful. It's Atlanta's new, what we call beachfront property.
That's fantastic. Oh my gosh, very exciting. So Ericka, I'm going to let Katie run this conversation, but I know crisis communications is what we're going to talk about. So
Absolutely. I think, Ericka, when we actually kind of approached you about being a part of the PR Reimagined panel, I kind of stalked you. So I was seeking out some of the best, communications and PR professionals in the city, and you came up to the top of the list. So I think this is very appropriate for this conversation. And I know that, you have a history of, crisis communications and a lot of background in really managing those types of situations. And I know a lot of people probably think, it's a PR and a media problem, but it's actually a business problem.
It is.
So I want to kind of go into, I know that right now, probably 2017, the biggest crisis of the year probably was Pepsi or even United. And there was just so many things that they did wrong, and a lot of things that if there was some preparation, probably could have came out a little bit differently. So I just want to kind of dive into that. So can someone on the inside of a company really call out, kind of something like this happening early? No one can really kind of know when a crisis is going to happen, but in the situation with Pepsi, I think that there could have been some different stakeholders at the table when they were actually creating this ad that could have prevented, the actual crisis happening and the kind of out of control feedback and negative feedback they received from social media.
Oh, yeah. I think that one of the things, to your point, is that in my experience, whenever a crisis comes, there's sort of these little telltale things. There's a saying that I believe, and I say it all the time, the devil is in the details. And so there are things that organizations often miss, but there's always that one person who's not missing anything, and they might bring it up. And usually sometimes with private companies in the private sector, I see it's a customer service thing. There might be that person that, well, here's a complaint we got. Well, here's a complaint we got. Well, here's a complaint we got. And I tell people customer service is in its own form of PR. Mm-hmm. When it starts to snowball and there's the same problem, then it becomes a PR issue.
Absolutely.
And if it's handled on the front end, it never, I can tell you folks get mad at me when I say that. If it's handled on the front end, it never has to get to me, just in the gentle, dulcet tones. But as it relates to Pepsi, it also talks about the organization, about, like you said, who you have at the table. Mm-hmm. And I think that when we look at best practices for organizations, having a diverse group of voices at the table means that it doesn't mean that you'll be perfect and that you'll miss an opportunity to avoid a crisis. It just means that you have so many different perspectives at the table that it's highly unlikely that you'll miss a perspective because you have so many diverse voices. And I think with Pepsi, the challenge sounds like the Pepsi challenge. I gave them 3 aspects. The challenge is there's always got to be somebody in that room that'll go, you know what? I don't think that this might go well. I recently had a conversation where somebody pitched something to me and said, I think this would be a funny idea for us to do on social media. And I said, you know what? That's a cute idea. The problem is everybody doesn't have your sense of humor.
That's true.
And they're like, oh. I said, so what might be funny to you may not be funny to another group or masses. So when you think, you can't think inside of your backyard. You've got to think inside of everybody's backyard. And that's the challenge of public relations, because we are such a beautiful, diverse country that when we're pitching and we're having marketing, we have to think beyond what we know and think of what's possible for people to perceive. And that's a challenge. And I think that happens a lot, that, we might have to become chief perception officers.
Absolutely.
In our business, you have the challenge. We have people at the table. We talk about that. What will people think about what we do and what we say? And if you have somebody who is constantly being that barometer in an organization, it makes you less likely to face a crisis. But you got to also listen to them when they tell you this might not go well.
Mm-hmm. Well, that kind of brings me to, when a crisis does happen, who should be in the war room? Mm-hmm. I know you talked about customer service. Mm-hmm. I'm always thinking, no matter what, there shouldn't always be just high-level people in the room.
You're right.
I know that you're a champion for millennials. You're always talking about millennials. Yes. So who should be in that room making those decisions collectively together?
I always think, of course, you're going to have your leader of the organization, the CEO. And I think and he's sitting in the room, or she's sitting in the room, to get the benefit of the best advice. Because at the end of the day, the buck stops with that person on what the organization decides to do. And I'm always very well aware of that with the leader of my organization. Yeah. So I always say, you know what? I'm going to give you the benefit of the best advice. But when we have a conversation about who needs to be in this room, then it's always going to be, you got to have your person who's going to talk about it. It's got to be your communications person.
Absolutely.
But it's also got to be the people who are intimately involved with the work. And then you need an outsider. Because there are people who are intimately involved in the work, whether it's, say, for instance, if you have United and in that situation, you're like, okay, so the guy who's, over security, he's going to be in the room. Well, his perspective is going to be like, I have a job to do with security. But then your communications person is going to be talking about, well, how are we going to manage the information to the public about how you balance security and how you balance safety, and at the same time make sure we're respectful of the customer. So then, of course, you're going to have your head or whoever's responsible for customer service in that organization to say, this is how we make sure our customers feel valued. And then at the end of the day, you've got to pick, and there's always a person you can identify. I always say it's the naysayer. It's that strange person who's that army of no in your organization, and we like to say, oh my gosh, here comes negative Nelly. They're not going to like anything. Why are you bringing them in the room? You're bringing them in the room because they're going to represent 20%, that what I call that 20%. So if you already have a fan base and people love you, that's about 60% of folk. Then you have 20% who are ambivalent, who can go either way. They can go with the 60, and then you got that 20% that's not going to like anything that you do.
The Debbie Downers.
Yeah, the Debbie Downers. Exactly. They're not
Yeah.
going to like anything you do, but they influence that 20%, which can start scratching away at your 60.
Yeah.
So you need a person in the room to represent that Debbie Downer and say, what is the worst possible thing that could come out of it? What's the most horrible thing that you think that we did? How do you think we just royally dropped the ball on that? Let them get it out. And then you might find that out of there is a kernel of, oh,
Yeah.
we didn't think about this. How do we market, or how do we ensure that our messaging also addresses that 20%? And so I think once you fill your room with those people, the person who does the work, intimately involved, your leader of your organization, your communications person, and I have to say this for our VP and general counsel, you got to have your lawyer in the room.
Absolutely.
But you will find that the lawyer and your communicator sometimes, because we'll go, just because it's legally right doesn't mean that perceptually it's going to look right. So and that's a good energy to have between the two of them. And then you've got to have that one person who is, I say that you call them the naysayer, but that's that keep it 100. I'm just going to say it how I feel person, even if you don't like to hear it in the room.
Well, that's interesting because, you're in the room. A lot of time is being spent, coming up with what the strategy is. Everyone knows time is everything.
Yes.
And time is money.
Yes.
So what do you think is the best timing for releasing an apology or saying that we're releasing the facts? What does that timeline look like?
And and I will tell you as a communicator, and you probably know this, sometimes the challenge, and I know you know this, sometimes the challenge is getting information. And we go back to gathering information and gathering facts together. And my timing is always like this, because what we recognize is news is instantaneous now. We used to have the luxury, and I'm aging myself. You guys are probably still in your 20s, but I'm knocking on 50.
You're right.
Yeah,
You're 100% right.
Absolutely.
But I remember the day when I had 24 to 48 hours to get information out. But with social media, you don't have that type of time. And so one of the things when you talk about an apology, I always say there's no error in an apology.
That is true.
Because see, people are going to accept, if somebody tells you they're sorry and then they find out later it wasn't their fault, there's still nothing bad about you being the bigger person and saying I'm sorry, even when you weren't wrong. So I think it's easier to just say, you know what, we'll take the hit for this. And then at the same time, let people know, we apologize for the fact that this has caused a great concern. This has caused an inconvenience that we've created. So there must be something in our system that either we've got to be able to communicate better or we've got to do something better. But in the process of this, bear with us because all the facts have not come out. And we want to make sure that we get you the full information. And we may be coming back with you with a bigger apology than this one. But we want to make sure that you know that we recognize that something didn't click, something didn't go wrong, and we got to figure out what that is. And if you'll bear with us with it, so that's the easy part.
I think that's great advice. And I think when a company goes quiet or doesn't say anything, and we're waiting and frustration rises, like you say, just apologizing and then collecting the facts afterwards, and that's great advice. And a lot of companies, I think, need to follow that.
Oh, absolutely. You can't get that silence back. It's like if we're on a podcast now, but if we suddenly stop talking and we had with dead air, you ever been in a car and then all of a sudden nothing? Then you're sitting in the car and you're like, what? Is anybody in the radio station? Yeah. What's going on? Then you start, what's going on? It's the same. You should never have dead air out there and waiting a week and thinking that people are not, especially with social media. And you've got video out there. Yeah. like the poor gentleman that was dragged up with United. Every time I kept seeing the video, is it me or did the video get worse? It's the same video.
Yeah.
You know, it was the exact same video, but I swear he had more blood. You know, I heard him, you know, yell louder. I start feeling sympathetic pains. You know, it just got worse, and I was just like, for the communications person, I always err on the side that we always know what we're doing, but there are people there who are not helping us with our job. So I was just like, that person's pulling their hair out. They're saying, can we just apologize? Here, I've written the apology. Can we just apologize? And there's somebody in that room saying, well, first we need to see. And that was the first, I think that was the first statement. We need to see what happened. We need to look at the video and talk to everybody. Okay. When you got video, you're looking at it. At a bare minimum, we have to have a threshold of what we know is acceptable for the general public.
Nothing was.
Dragging, you know, it just, you know, you can kind of
But
gauge
if you
the mood.
think about just that situation, I want to go back to how they responded. There was an email that was sent internally that to all of the employees stating that he was disruptive and belligerent.
That's right.
And it was leaked to the media, and that infuriated people.
Oh yeah, that made them very angry.
Made them very angry. And then internally also they mentioned that bumping was something that was a very common practice within the airline organization. So people should be used to having their seat, you know, given away or because they overbook all the time. So this is nothing new. And this individual happens to be kind of, no, I'm not accepting that.
But here's the interesting thing, and I think it's great that you brought up that point, because you brought up the earlier point that hits on it, and that is, they said their policy, their procedure is nothing new. What they didn't know is how people felt about it.
Absolutely.
And so that's when you come back, and even if you have something that you do all the time, I'm a firm believer in customer satisfaction surveys. So you do it, and they say, and we give out money for people to do it. But if you drill down and start asking the questions of, like, you know, start asking folks, do you feel pressure to do it? Because I know I've been waiting on a plane, and I'm sitting there, and they're saying, okay, we booked this plane, you know, we've overbooked this plane, and I had someplace to be. So
that just recently happened to me. So yes.
And do you start mentally digging in your heels?
Yes, you do.
I'm not moving my seat. I paid for this seat. You know, you're in your head. That's what you're thinking.
You're standing your ground.
So you're standing your ground, and you're looking around at everybody else, like, you know, you're doing a mental, like, gunfight. You're like doo you know, looking around. Who's gonna blink?
Who's looking the more casual one on the plane who can afford to not be at that meeting?
Exactly. And you already have it in your head, and they're going up on the price. All right, we'll throw in some trips to Puerto Rico. Well, not Puerto Rico, but we'll throw in Jamaica. We'll throw in anything, and you're sitting there going, "There's no place. I've been there. I'm not going. And they start upping it, and then you listen to them, and it's just kind of like, look, folks, this plane is not going anywhere until one of you gives up your seat.
Yeah.
And
that whole experience,
it's
terrible.
It's traumatic because depending on who you are, and as I understand it, this gentleman was a doctor.
Yes, he was.
So depending on who you are, your level of anxiety about where you have to be heightens in that moment. And then even if you're the person that goes, you know what, fine, I'll do it, you're still inconvenienced. And so there's an assumption, I think, that they made that the amount of money that they give supersedes the inconvenience, and that people will be happy.
And it wasn't the max either.
And
they only were given 1,000. They could give up to 1,300. So it just kind of plays into it was kind of a disaster waiting to happen. And if they had known early on, that whole situation, their whole policy and procedure for bumping, and now everybody's looking at it. And then did you see then other airlines kind of piled on and was like, well, here's what we do.
here are our rules, but I think you're going to see probably in the future and, some other things changing about that. But it now forces every other airline to look at their policy and procedure about bumping people off the planes. Then how do they handle when someone refuses to move? And so it goes back to your point about how crisis develops from company and organizations' policies and procedures more often than you think.
Well, this brings me to another great question. Do you think that all companies should have some sort of crisis communications plan in place?
Can you plan for a crisis? Yes. I think one of the things that we do is we have what we ensure is sort of we always have a social media policy and a media relations policy, and most companies have it, and it's driven by weather a lot. So they'll have sort of a natural disaster, inclement, everybody has to have sort of inclement weather, natural disaster type. How do we get, especially for, like what with the BeltLine, we talk about, when we had Irma and we were talking about, oh gosh, we have to, let's kick this in because there'll be people out there trying to walk the trails, trying to get those steps in with, wind blowing like this. So we had to make sure that we put out messaging and said, okay, please don't use the trail. Don't go on the hiking trail, things like that. I think they plan for those types of crises, but I don't think they have a communications plan, most of them, when there is a breakdown in their policy or when someone gets hurt. And I think what they do have to, at a minimum, have, when do we have, like you said, when we know that a crisis has happened, when do we have our first meeting in the war room?
Yep.
Like, when do we assemble? Do we assemble within the first 24 hours of notifying? How do we assess the degree of the crisis? And then who's in the room? And then at what point do we commit to a statement coming out? And I think if you do those three steps, and I know I try not to Monday morning quarterback somebody else's crisis, but if you have a step that says, when we have a crisis, if it's on a weekend, because I've been in that situation, a weekend crisis, especially working with county government, when we had the flood and then we had Snowmageddon, it was about, all right, we have a central phone, and you have email, and then it became, okay, what if there's no power, because we experienced that. So everybody has to have a call in. Well, then everybody has to remember, okay, landlines, you plug them in, you can't do that. So then it becomes like, okay, you start drilling down to, can you make sure everybody's cell phone is charged, or you have a backup power source if you are part of the war team? And so then it becomes, all right, so we know we have this crisis. Usually the communications person is the first person to hear about the crisis from someone outside of the internal to the organization, but close to the problem. They notify them. The communicator then sends out, all right, to the CEO, we have a crisis. They deploy, everybody needs to get on this call if it's on the weekend, or everybody needs to meet in this room within within an hour. And then we break it down, find out what we know, and then we decide from there, how soon can we get a statement out? And that's three things that everybody should kind of have somewhere written down. This is how we're going to hit a crisis.
I think that's important. So once the crisis, things have kind of settled down, does it actually end? Does a crisis actually come to an end? I know that with, United Airlines, it's a commodity business. The cheapest flight, it's not really going to hurt their business that much. People want to be comfortable and they want the cheapest flight. So they were in it for a while. I think it was like a month, and then they were back to business as usual. So when does the crisis end and you're ready to kind of push forward, with your new messaging and, people have forgiven you ultimately?
Well, one of the things I firmly believe that I've learned over time is that the crisis ends, but people's memories are long. So if you think, well, this is over, and then I can feel comfortable, and let's go back to our, the way things were. Let's go back to our regularly scheduled program. What happens is you're going to have another crisis, and then you're going to be mad because they're talking about your previous crisis and how you will remember they had this. It may not have any. You may have a whole brand new crisis.
Well, there's memes still out there that exists.
But it still exists. So what you have to do is, I think you understand, you pivot to like, okay, making sure that they know that there's a constant message of this is handled. This has been corrected. We fixed that. I think you incorporate in future messaging, you bring it up. Like you're saying, you kind of have a conversation of when you're talking about your successes and say, we're so proud of these successes because just last year, we were battling this and now we can show, but then you're showing data, you're showing numbers of how you improved it and how you fixed it. And so that's where you get that forgiveness from folks, because you're reminding them that you never forgot it, that they were just that important to you, that you didn't forget it. And now you're so vigilant, you're making sure that you build everything else in your organization on making sure that they know how much you value the confidence they've placed in your corporation.
And Erika, on the subject of how did it end? How does a crisis end? Our podcast is coming to an end. We can keep talking forever.
It's such a great conversation.
For our listeners and our watchers, can you let them know how they can contact you if they would like to follow up, if they have any questions at all? What's the best way for them to reach you?
I'm at Davis at atlbeltline.org. You can call my office, 404-477-3660. I'm on Twitter at Davis I think it's at Erika. Oh, that's crazy. And you can find me on Twitter, Erika Davis. Just contact Media Frenzy even. They know how to track me down. You know how to track me down.
Yeah, Katie did that.
And I'll be happy to depart what knowledge I have.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank
you. Thank you.